Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our Thursday morning Parsha Shiur. This week is Parsha's Toldos, and we're going to study some of the commentary and the insights on Parsha's Toldos. Amazingly, the commentaries in many different places in this week's Parsha connect what goes on in the Parsha to the story of Purim and Mordechai and Hamman and the things that they experienced. And so woven in a couple of different places in the Parsha, we find special connection to Purim. So although we're getting ready for Hanukkah, we'll learn together some of the connections between this week's Parsha and the story of Purim. Let's start with three of the wells that the Torah tells us Yaakov and his men dig. If you have a Chumash in front of you, open to Perek Chavov, Possuk Yutes. Vayachbru Avdei Yitzchak Banochal, the servants of Yitzchak dig in the valley. Vayimtzeu Sham, and they find there Be'er Mayim Chayim, a beautiful expression, a well of living water. But the locals, Royei Geror, the local shepherds, Vayorivu Royei Gerorim Roy Yitzchak, they fight with the shepherds of Yitzchak, Lamer, and they claim Lonu Hamayim. They claim the water is theirs. It's a real estate dispute in the Middle East. Nothing new. The locals say it's ours because you found the water on our land, and instead of the water being a source of life and growth and optimism, it turns out to be a source of contention. In fact, they even named the well Esek, which means contention. Because of the struggle that's going on over who really owns the water. Says the Torah, so the servants of Yitzchak dig another well. And this one also falls under contention. The locals claim it's theirs. They name the second well Sitna. The word sitna means animosity and hatred because of the hatred between the locals and the servants of Yitzchak that this well elicits. Vayatek misham, so Yitzchak leaves, he uproots himself from there, and he goes somewhere else. Vayachbar be'eracheres, and he digs one more, a third well. This time the locals leave him alone; they don't fight with him. Vayikra Shmo, says the Torah, Rechoivos. They call this well Rechoivos. Rechoivos means expansiveness, broadness. Vayomer, and Yitzchak said, Ki atu, because now finally, Hirchev Hashem lanu, Hashem has made it good for us. Ufarinu ba'oretz, we'll be fruitful in the land. They reached finally menucha and nachla, they reached peace and tranquility. The Ramban, very famously, comments on these Pessukim that it's difficult to understand why the Torah is making such a big fuss and such a big deal over the fact that Yitzchak dug wells. I mean, of the 180 years that Yitzchak lives, we know so little about his life. We know the Akedah, we know the story of the Shidduch, we know the story of him giving the brachas to Yaakov instead of Esav, but barely the Torah tells us for 180 years, what was he doing? We know very, very little. Really, the only thing the Torah makes a big deal out of in terms of what Yitzchak actually did with his life, Yitzchak lived 180 years, the longest of all the Avos. The only thing the Torah tells us is that he dug wells. And the Ramban says it's difficult to understand why the Torah making such a big deal out of this business of digging wells. And he gives a famous, really novel insight. The Ramban says that the three wells that Yitzchak and his men dug, the first two which were contested and the source of hatred, the third one which was finally the source of peace and tranquility and expansiveness, represent the three Batei Mikdash, the three Beis HaMikdash. The first two were destroyed, just like the first two wells they fought over. And the third one represents the third Beis HaMikdash, which will be rebuilt with the coming of Mashiach, of course. And that was called Rechoivos, because at that point, finally, Hashem will give us relief from our enemies who fight us in Eretz Yisrael. Ufarinu Boris will be fruitful in the land. And so Yitzchak, the ancestor of all the Jews, digs these three wells, and they're indicative of what's to come with his descendants, each well representing a Beis HaMikdash. This is the very famous interpretation of the Ramban. The Ramban actually adds something, sort of as a detail in this explanation, which is connected to the story of Purim, as I just mentioned. The second well, the Torah says, the servants of Yitzchak, or Yitzchak himself, names the well Sitna. Sitna, like I said before, means animosity, hatred, things like that. So the Ramban says, I'll show you that the word Sitna is connected specifically to the second Beis HaMikdash. Because the word Sitna appears somewhere else in Tanakh. Where? So this is actually from Sefer Ezra, Perek Daled, Possuk Vav. And here the Torah talks about one of the attempts that were made by the Jews to rebuild the second Beis HaMikdash, actually before the proper time. This attempt failed because of a reason I'm about to say. But it was one of the attempts made to rebuild the second Beis HaMikdash. This idea, this Possuk from Ezra that I'm about to tell you, is actually quoted in Rashi's commentary on the Megillah. When the Megillah introduces us to Aseres B'nei Hamman, right? Aseres B'nei Hamman, Rashi quotes this Possuk that the Even Ezra quotes with the word Sitna. I'm going to read it to you from the Rashi in Megillah, but the Ramban says the same idea. On the words Aseres B'nei Hamman in the Megillah, Rashi writes like this: Ro'isi b'Seder Olam. Rashi says, I saw in a Sefer called Seder Olam that recounts Jewish history all the way from the beginning. Elu Asara shekosvu Sitna al Yehuda v'Yerushalayim. These 10 sons of Hamman, these weren't the only 10 sons of Hamman. Hamman had many sons. There's different opinions in the Gemara ranging from 30 to 214. But specifically these 10 sons, the ones named by the Megillah, it's in Seder Olam it says that these sons are the ones who wrote letters of hatred against the Jewish people in Yerushalayim. Sefer Ezra, Rashi says, as is written in Sefer Ezra, quote, in Sefer Ezra, Perek Daled Possuk Vav, the following Possuk appears. Ubemalchus Achashverosh, during the reign of Achashverosh, this would have been within the first 2 years or 3 years of his reign. Betchilas Malchusa, in the early stages of his empire, of his kingdom, Kosvu Sitna, there were those who wrote letters of hate al Yoshvei Yehuda v'Yerushalayim, against those who lived in Yehuda and Yerushalayim. Now, what did they write? What was written in these letters of hate, says Rashi? Levatel ha'olam min ha'goyla she'eschilu livnei sesabayis. They wrote letters of hate against those Jews who had come up from the Golus, and they had started rebuilding the second Beis HaMikdash, Bimei Koresh, in the days of Koresh, the king before Achashverosh. She'eschilu livnei sesabayis, who had begun to rebuild the second Beis HaMikdash. Says Rashi, v'ilchinu aleim hakutim. The locals gave a bad report about them to the Melech Achashverosh. V'hivdilum, and Achashverosh stopped them. The locals, when they saw that the Jews were attempting to build the second Beis HaMikdash in the beginning of the days of Achashverosh, so they wrote and they elicited the royal decree to stop the building of the second Beis HaMikdash. And when in writing this, in talking about this, the Torah says, Kosvu Sitna. They wrote hate. So you see, says the Ramban, that the word Sitna is associated with the second Beis HaMikdash. All right, this is what's written in the Ramban. I just want to add here parenthetically, Bechlal, the idea that the story of Megillas Esther, the story of Purim that we read about in Megillas Esther, takes place within the context of the Jewish people having tried to rebuild the second Beis HaMikdash, and Achashverosh himself in the beginning of his Malchus being the one who stopped them. This sheds a tremendously fascinating layer of understanding in the whole story of Purim. If you bear this in mind from a historic contextual perspective, the story takes on a different meaning completely. For example, right, we always know that the meal that Achashverosh throws, the party that he throws at the beginning of the Megillah, he used the kelim of the Beis HaMikdash. He dressed himself in the garments of the Kohen Gadol. In fact, he was celebrating the fact that the Beis HaMikdash wasn't being rebuilt. Right, we all know this. But if you understand the historic context, the pshat is much deeper than that. The pshat is Achashverosh himself was the one who had put the construction of the Beis HaMikdash to a halt. He was the one who prevented it. He was concerned, in other words, he was concerned that he would be outdone. He was concerned that he would be overpowered by the Jewish people. But he managed to squash it, he managed to hold it. So he was celebrating the fact that he was victorious in preventing the Beis HaMikdash from being rebuilt. Which of course gives us so much of a deeper understanding into what was the sin, the meaning of the fact that the Jewish people, the Gemara says, were held accountable for going to this meal and enjoying it. What's wrong with going to a meal and enjoying it? All right, there's many layers to the understanding of it, but even on a simple level, this party was being thrown by Achashverosh to celebrate his success in stopping to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. That's why he put the kelim of the Beis HaMikdash on the table, and that's why he dressed himself as a Kohen Gadol. And that's why we can understand why he invited the Jews. He wanted to sort of cement his victory in this regard. Also, again, parenthetically, also it explains why when Esther approaches Achashverosh uninvited, right? The Medrash says very famously, Achashverosh complained, "When I call my wives, they don't come. When I don't call them, they do come." When Esther approaches Achashverosh uninvited, Achashverosh extends his staff and he says to her, "You can ask me for whatever you want, ad chatzi amalchus." All right, the simple pshat is, I'll give you half the kingdom. We didn't sign a prenup. Half of what's owned by me is owned by you. But the Gemara says very famously that Achashverosh, before Esther opened her mouth, Achashverosh said to her, "Don't ask me to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash." And when you read it at first, you're like, okay, who's talking about the Beis HaMikdash? Why are we bringing up the Beis HaMikdash here? Why is that even important? Achashverosh at this point doesn't even know that Esther is Jewish. Why would he automatically assume that she's coming to ask for the Beis HaMikdash? The commentaries say, simple. What was the real reason why Achashverosh prevented the Jews from rebuilding the second Beis HaMikdash? Because of his wife. Who was he married to at the time? At the time he was married to Vashti. Vashti was the great-granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar. Vashti said to her husband, "I'm royal blood, you're not. You're only a king because of me. I'm not going to let you give the Jews permission to rebuild the second Beis HaMikdash and undo my great-grandfather's legacy. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the Beis HaMikdash and sent the Jewish people into Golus. Over my dead body," said Vashti, "you're not going to give them permission to rebuild it." All right? So Vashti's put to death. Not because of that, but not directly because of that, but eventually Vashti's put to death. And Esther becomes his second wife. So when Achashverosh sees Esther approach him, Achashverosh is assuming that the second wife wants to undo everything that was accomplished by the first wife. She wants to establish her Balabatishkeit. So Achashverosh assumes that Esther has come to undo the decree that he had put into place because of the influence of his first wife. This is his new wife, even though he doesn't know she's Jewish. Achashverosh says, "It's not going to happen. I promised the Jews that I wasn't, I swore to the enemies of the Jews that I wasn't going to rebuild the second Beis HaMikdash." Achashverosh says, "I gave my word, I cannot take it back." It turns out that's not what Esther came to ask, but it explains to us why Achashverosh's head goes there initially. All right. End of parenthetic comment. The idea is that the whole story of the Megillah takes place between one failed attempt and the following successful attempt to rebuild the second Beis HaMikdash. Eventually, permission to rebuild the second Beis HaMikdash is given to the Jews actually by a son born to Achashverosh and Esther, also, if I remember correctly, by the name of Koresh or Daryavesh, who gives the Jews finally permission to go to Eretz Yisrael. Be it as it may, the Ramban's point is that the word Sitna, which is the name of the second well, is used in the Torah in Sefer Ezra, describing the efforts of the sons of Haman, these 10 sons in particular, named in the Megillah, their successful, at least temporarily successful, activities in petitioning the king to stop the rebuilding of the second Beis HaMikdash. And so Sitna, you see, is connected to the second Beis HaMikdash. Okay. We find the connection between Parshas Toldos and Purim in two more places. I'll tell you where they are. The next place is at the end of the story, at the beginning of the Parsha, of Esav selling the birthright to Yaakov. All right, the Torah tells the whole story, right? Esav comes in from the field. Yaakov is in the middle of cooking lentils. And Esav asks Yaakov to pour some lentils into his mouth, down his throat. Yaakov says, "You have to sell me the Bechorah." And Esav sells it to him. For Yaakov, Nosan LaEsav says that the Possuk concludes, Perek Chav Hey, Possuk Lamed Dalet. Yaakov gave Esav lechem, bread, which is in its own right a question, what's the bread doing here? But he gives him bread, unazid adoshim, and the pot of lentils, Vayochal Vayesht. Esav eats and drinks. Vayokom, he gets up, Vayelech, and he goes. Final 4 words, Vayivez Esav es haBechorah. Esav disgraced the birthright. On a simple level, what does the Torah mean? He disgraced the birthright. He sold it for a pot of lentil soup. I mean, the Bechorah, he sold it for a pot of lentil soup. This was the Torah. Vayivez Esav es haBechorah. He disgraced it. Says the Baal Haturim, Vayivez, and he disgraced. Beis. We find it twice in Tanakh. There's another place in Tanakh where the word Vayivez appears. Where is that? Vayivez be'enov gabe Hamman. Vayivez be'enov gabe Hamman. The Torah says in Megillas Esther, Perek Gimel, Vayivez concerning Hamman, Vayivez be'enov l'shloyach yod b'Mordechai levadai. So what's going on over there? Mordechai refused to bow down to Hamman. All the other Jews did bow down, but not Mordechai. So really, Haman's only axe to grind should have been with Mordechai. Why does Haman go out and try to declare and commit genocide against the entire Jewish nation? They were all bowing down to him. It was only Mordechai who was starting up. In fact, the Gemara says the Jews were upset with Mordechai for starting up. So what's Mordechai got? What's Haman got with the whole Jewish nation? Says the Megillah, Vayivez be'enov l'shloyach yod b'Mordechai levadai. Haman said, it's beneath my dignity just to attack, just to wage war with the one person who refuses to bow down to me. Mordechai. Once they told him that Mordechai is a Jew, and Noch, the quintessential Jew, Haman said, I'm going to wipe out all the Jews. Vayivez, the word, that's not a simple Vayivez. That's Nishke Posh of the Maisa. Vayivez be'enov, Haman feels humiliated to just go out and kill Mordechai. He makes it his mission to wipe out the entire Jewish nation. Says the Baal Haturim, Vayivez Esav esabchoira. Esav disgraces the firstborn. Vayivez be'enov gabi Haman, the same word Vayivez. What's the connection between Esav disgracing the firstborn and Haman feeling disgraced to just take revenge against Mordechai? Again, in the Baal Haturim style, 5-6 words of explanation. Tahainu, says the Baal Haturim. This is the reason why the Torah tells us, the Torah refers to Haman as Boiza ben Boiza. The disgracer, the disgrace, the descendant of the disgracer disgraced. It's a play on the word of the Medrash. About Esav the Torah says Vayivez, and about Haman the Torah says Vayivez. So when Haman tries to annihilate the Jewish people, the Torah refers to him as disgraced, descendant of a disgraced. Ze Haman sheyotza me'Esav. That's all he says. Ze Haman sheyotza me'Esav. Haman, who was a descendant of Esav. Now, by the way, how do we know where do we know that Haman is a descendant of Esav? We know that Haman is a descendant of Agag Melech Amalek. But where do we see that Haman is a descendant of Esav? Where does this yichus come from? So this, of course, we know because the initial Amalek, there was an individual. Where does the nation of Amalek come from? The nation of Amalek comes from an individual. There was a man called Amalek. Amalek was the son of a man called Eliphaz. Eliphaz is Esav's son. In fact, Eliphaz has this son of his, Amalek, from a concubine, from a Pelegesh called Timnah, which is a tremendously, tremendously painful story in its own right. Because the Gemara says in Sanhedrin that Timnah wanted to convert. She was from a royal family. She wanted to convert. Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov didn't accept her. She agreed to be a concubine of Eliphaz, the son of Esav, because that she felt was the only way she could become connected to this special family of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So she agrees to humiliate, there it is, the same concept again. She agrees to, so to speak, humiliate herself and be a concubine for Eliphaz. But they have a son called Amalek, who is responsible, Rahman al-Islam, for all the tzoros of Klal Yisrael, including Agag Melech Amalek, and including eventually Haman, who Agag is the descendant of Agag. Says the Baal Haturim, Zeh Haman sheyotza me'Esav. Haman, the descendant of Esav. But again, he doesn't explain to us what really is the connection between Haman and Esav. Haman saying Vayivez, and the Megillah saying Vayivez about Haman, and the Torah saying Vayivez about Esav. Just that one was a descendant of the other, and by both of them it says Vayivez. All right. So now we have a second connection between our Parsha and Purim. Number one, Sitna, the Ramban says, the second Beis HaMikdash, is this the well called Sitna, referring to the second Beis HaMikdash, is the same word the Torah uses in describing the 10 sons of Haman's efforts to delay the building of the second Beis HaMikdash. Number two, Vayivez. Vayivas Esav Esab and Vayivas Be'enov by Haman. In both cases, the Torah uses the word Vayivas Esav disgraces the firstborn, and Haman is disgraced to just take revenge against Mordechai. He insists on annihilating the entire Jewish nation. And then you have it in one more place. And this is just liquid gold. Sfasai Mishak. Listen to this. The Torah says, Vayomer Esav el Yaakov. Esav comes in from the field before he sells the firstborn. Esav comes in from the field, and he sees that Yaakov is cooking this soup. Esav is exhausted. Right? He's exhausted from, Rashi says, from idol worship, from adultery, from murder. He's exhausted. Vayomer Esav el Yaakov, and Esav says to Yaakov, quote, Haliteini no min ha'odaim hazeh. He said, please. Well-mannered. Haliteini no, please. Haliteini no, please let me swallow from this red soup, from this lentil soup. Says the Baal Haturim. Haliteini no min, the three words. Haliteini no, please. Haliteini no min, please let me swallow from this soup. Rosh Tevis Haman. Haliteini no min, Rosh Tevis Haman. Hey, it's actually out of order. Haliteini, hey, no, nun, min, mem. Hey, nun, mem, switch the nun and the mem around, you get Haman. Haliteini no min, Haman. Rosh Tevis Haman. No, as they say in Yiddish, wie is the Yovan reingefallen in Sukkah. How does Haman get here? Right? Sitna, second Beis Hamikdash, 10 sons of Haman. Vayivas Esav Esab is Vayivas Be'ena. Weiter Haman, Haliteini no min, Rosh Tevis Haman. What do we want? Baal Haturim drops a ripping atom bomb. Listen to these words. Or if you have a Baal Haturim in front of you, follow along. One line. Loimar, says the Baal Haturim, you know why Haliteini no min, Esav asking Yaakov to give him from this lentil soup. You know why it's Rosh Tevis Haman? Loimar, to teach you like this. Keshem she Yaakov kono me Esav b'chayrosai belechem va'adoshim. Just as Yaakov purchased his firstborn, just as Yaakov purchased the firstborn right from Esav, belechem va'adoshim, for bread and lentils. Just as Yaakov purchased the birthright from Esav for bread and lentils, kach kono Mordechai es Haman le'eved b'pas lechem. So Mordechai purchased Haman as a slave for a piece of bread. I got to read this again. Loimar, says the Baal Haturim, to teach you. Keshem she Yaakov kono me Esav b'chayrosei belechem va'adoshim. Just like Yaakov purchased his birthright from Esav for bread and lentils, so kach kono Mordechai es Haman le'eved b'pas lechem. So Mordechai purchased Haman for himself as a slave for a piece of bread. Now, what in heaven's name is the Baal Haturim talking about? I'll tell you. We're not learning Megillas Esther, so I'm going to tell you just in brief, but there is a tremendous amount of arichas on this in the Medrash, fascinating insights from the Chassam Sofer and others on this. It's mentioned very briefly in the Gemara, but the story is articulated in the Medrash at great length, Megillas Esther. The story in brief is that Mordechai and Haman have a long-standing relationship that began long before the story of Haman, long before the story of Purim. They were not introduced to each other then. They knew each other from way back. In fact, says the Medrash, they were both generals in Achashverosh's army. Achashverosh ruled the entire world. He had to fight wars to be victorious, to conquer these parts of the land. Mordechai and Haman were both generals in the army of Achashverosh, and they both fought wars for Achashverosh, and they were both victorious. But Haman and his men ran out of provisions. They ran out of food. They were dying of hunger and thirst. They ran out of food and water. They were gluttonous. They went through their provisions too quickly. Mordechai and his men were self-disciplined. They rationed the food, they rationed the water, and they had plenty. Says the Medrash, my dear friends, one day Haman comes crawling to Mordechai, long before the story of Purim. One day Haman comes crawling to Mordechai and says, Mordechai, I'm dying of starvation. I need a piece of bread. Give me a piece of bread, and I promise you, when we get back to civilization, I'll pay you for it no matter what you want. Now you read the story and you have to wonder, why didn't Mordechai let Haman starve to death? would have saved the Jews a lot of heartache. He didn't. He gave Haman the piece of bread, but he didn't give it to him for free. He took payment. Haman said, I'll give you as much money as you want. Mordechai said, you don't have any money on you, and I'm not giving it to you on credit. I'm going to give you a piece of bread, said Mordechai to Haman. But in exchange, I want you to give me yourself to me as a slave. Sell yourself to me as a slave. Haman said, absolutely, otherwise I die of starvation. Mordechai said, not so fast. We're going to write a document. They scratch Haman's finger, the Medrash says, with Haman's blood. He writes it at the bottom of Mordechai's shoe. I, Haman ben Hamdasa Hoagogi, sell myself as a slave to Mordechai HaYehudi in exchange for a piece of bread. Witnesses signed it. And Mordechai kept it. Eventually, they both make their way to civilization. Haman survives. Mordechai, of course, survives. Haman gets promoted to becoming the viceroy and the most powerful man in the world under Achashverosh. And Haman comes home one day and tells his family, all the Jewish people are bowing down to me, except Mordechai. I have wealth, says Haman. I have fame. I have success. Roiv Bono were introduced for the first time to the fact that Haman has sons. I have many sons, again, according to some opinions of the Gemara, 214 sons, probably from more than one wife. Please God. I have so many sons, I have so much wealth. Says the Gemara, he pointed to his chest, where he had carried on his chest a document with all of his assets. The Chol Zeh points Haman to himself, to his chest, to his wealth, to his family, to his sons, to his pomp, to his fame, to his stature, to his clout, to his political wisdom. B'chol zeh einenu shoiveli. It's all worth nothing to me, says Haman. B'chol eis asher ani royes Mordechai HaYehudi. When I see Mordechai. When I see Mordechai, says Haman, everything I have is worth nothing. Frek the Gemara. Why? Just because you see a Jew, Mordechai, everything you have is worth nothing? You're the second most powerful person in the world. You're so jealous, everything you have is worth nothing. Why is it worth nothing? Says the Gemara, it wasn't just that he was angry. It wasn't just that he was jealous. He wasn't being euphemistic. He was being literal. He told his family, you don't understand. I sold myself as a slave to this Jew, Mordechai. Every time I walk past him, instead of him bowing down to me, he lifts his foot. With his shoe, we're scratched in the bottom of it. I sold myself to him as a slave. No. The halacha is, whatever is owned by a slave is owned by his master. Everything I have is Mordechai. I don't own a thing. Even myself I don't own. B'chol zeh, he points to himself. B'chol zeh, it's not worth anything. I'm his slave. All right, his family hears that. They tell him, you have no choice. You got to get rid of him. But the Gemara says this is what it means. Says the Baal Haturim, you want to know why when Esav tells Yaakov, pour the lentil soup down my throat, you don't want to know why he says, Haliteni no min Rosh Tevis Haman? Because the Torah wants us to know that just like Yaakov bought Esav as a slave for lechem, for bread, va'adoshim and lentils, so Mordechai purchased Haman as a slave for a piece of bread. End of commentary of the Baal Haturim. I want to add something here, parenthetically, just to put things in perspective. At the end of this week's Parsha, of course, we read that Yaakov presents himself as Esav to their father Yitzchak. And Yitzchak gives Yaakov the bracha, thinking that he's giving it to Esav. And then Esav himself walks in and identifies himself as Esav, and Yitzchak realizes that he's given the brachas not to Esav but to Yaakov. And the Possuk says, Vayecharad Yitzchak charodo gedola ad moed. Yitzchak trembled tremendously. He was worried that he had given the bracha to the wrong son. Until Esav slipped and he said, he's called Yaakov because he tricked me twice. He took my firstborn and now he took my bracha. Yitzchak said, what do you mean he took your firstborn? Esav said, he bought it, he sold it, he bought it from me for a pot of lentil soup. Yitzchak said, in that case, Gam Baruch Yeh, Baruch Hashem, I gave it to the right person. I gave the bracha. If he bought the birthright from you, I gave it to the right person. So the Torah says that Esav cried and begged his father, please, Habrocha acha silacha avi, Father, do you not have one bracha for me? Do you not even have one bracha? Come on. So you blessed him, you thought it was me. Give me a bracha, epa, something. And the Torah says, Yitzchak responds to his son Esav, and he says, what do you mean? Hein gvir samtiv loch. I already made him the owner over you. When I benched my son Yaakov, I said, Yavducha amim v'ishtachavu l'chol umim. Nations should serve you, nations should bow down to you. Have a gvir la'achecho, you'll be a master over your brothers. V'yishtachavu l'chol b'nei imecho. And the sons of your mother, in this case, Esav, will bow down to you. So Yitzchak says to Esav, I can bless you from here today till tomorrow. Whatever I bless you with will automatically go to your brother, because whatever a slave owns is automatically owned by his master. There it is, the same concept again. The connection that the Baal Haturim is making between Yaakov purchasing the birthright from Esav and Mordechai purchasing Hamman as a slave is articulated in the Torah in both cases in no uncertain terms. Hamman says, I know that whatever I own is owned by Mordechai because I'm his slave. Kol ma shekona eved kona rabbi. Whatever a slave owns is automatically owned by his master. And Yitzchak tells Esav the same thing. He says, it doesn't matter what I'm going to bless you. Excuse me. He says, it doesn't matter what I'm going to bless you with. Whatever I'm going to bless you with is automatically going to go to him. Kol ma shekona eved kona rabbi. All right. And so the Baal Haturim makes this connection between Yaakov purchasing the birthright from Esav and Mordechai purchasing Hamman as a slave. All right. Now let's try to understand. These are some of the connections that the commentaries make between Parshas Toldos and Purim. Again, number one, Sitna, the word being used for Yitzchak's second well, representing the second Beis HaMikdash, a word the Torah uses in Ezra to describing the efforts by the 10 sons of Hamman to halt the building of the second Beis HaMikdash. Number two, the word Vayivez Esav v'sabchayra. Esav disgraces the firstborn. And again by Hamman, Vayivez be'einav, Hamman is unsatisfied. He would be considered humiliated just to take revenge against Mordechai. For this reason, he declares genocide against the entire Jewish nation. Baal Haturim reminds us that Hamman was Esav's grandson. And number three, the Baal Haturim is comparing Haliteni no min Rosh Tevis Hamman, Yaakov purchasing the birthright from Esav, to Mordechai purchasing Hamman as a slave. All right. Now, let's try to give all of this some meaning. Sitna, the same word. Vayivez, the same word. Haliteni no min, Rosh Tevis Hamman. What's the connection? The second well of Yitzchak, the construction of the second Beis HaMikdash. Esav is disgracing the firstborn. Hamman would be humiliated just to take revenge against Mordechai. Yaakov purchases the birthright from Esav. Mordechai purchases Hamman as a slave. I mean, the commentaries seem to be throwing together a chulent of a gazillion ideas. What does all this mean? All right. Here's an insight. Let's ask a klotz kasha, an obvious question, a very basic sort of general question. The fact is that Esav was born first. Esav emerged into the world first. Yes, Rashi says Yaakov was conceived first, granted. But Esav practically came out first. What does it make a difference how many pot of lentils are served, cooked, how many pieces of bread are served? How can Yaakov purchase from Esav the fact that Esav was born first? And why does Yaakov, well, I was going to say, why does Yaakov want to? We can understand why he wants to, but how can you purchase the fact that somebody else was born first? What is this, selling? Imagine I tell you, I don't like the fact that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. I want to purchase it. Let's do the other way around. The sun should rise in the west and set in the east. It's a fact. The fact is that Esav was born first. What's Yaakov actually trying to buy? We keep saying the birthrights, but which birthrights? The firstborn rights. What are these firstborn rights? Now, in my humble opinion, it would be a mistake to say that Yaakov is purchasing the brachas. Yes, in the end, Yaakov gets the brachas. And in the end, Yitzchak concedes that Yaakov deserves the brachas because Yaakov bought the birthright. But it wasn't the brachas that were being purchased. And the proof is that although Yaakov was very eager to purchase the birthright, he wasn't very eager to get the brachas. If he thought he was buying the brachas, why did he have to have his mother push him in there? Not before Yaakov resists and says, no, I'm afraid he's going to curse me, etc. If you bought them, you bought them. So yes, it's true that in the end, because of this purchase, even on a transactional level, Yaakov deserves the brachas, of course. But it's not what Yaakov is trying to buy. And the proof is that despite his eagerness to buy this bechorah, he's still very hesitant to go in and take the brachas. So what's he actually buying? What does he think he's buying? Brooklyn Bridge? I mean, what's the significance of this sale? What does it mean? If you have a Chumash Rashi in front of you, you have to read these two Rashis and reflect on them, if but for a minute, because they are just unbelievable. Mind-boggling stuff. Perek Chafei, Possuk, Lamed Aleph. Vayomer Yaakov responds when Esav asks for the food. Yaakov says to him, Michra chayom es b'chayros chali. Sell me the b'chayra. Sell me the birthright, the firstborn rights. So Rashi b'chayros in typical Rashi style, 3 words. B'chayroscha, your firstborn. Lefi, 3 words. Lefi sheho avoida b'chayros. Lefi sheho avoida b'chayros. Because the avoida is done by firstborn. Which avoid is Rashi talking about? He doesn't even bother explaining because he assumes it's so obvious. The avoid of the Beis HaMikdash. Yaakov knew that in the future, the avoid in the Beis HaMikdash would be done by Bechorim, by firstborns. Omar Yaakov says, Ein Rosh hazeh kedai sheyakriv l'Kadosh Baruch Hu. It's not right that this Rosh Esav, true, he is the firstborn, but it's not right that this Rosh should be the one to offer up the sacrifices, should be the one to do the avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. Sell it to me. Was he hiding from Esav, that this was his intent? According to Rashi, absolutely not. He told Esav exactly what he wants, and he told him why he wants it. He told Esav, listen to me, you were born first. You can't change history. Can't change. You came out first, Beseder. But the avodah, the service of Hashem that will take place in the Beis HaMikdash, Karbonis, working in the Beis HaMikdash, all etc., all the rest of it belongs to Bechoros, belongs to the firstborns. Which meant, again, this is the way I understand what Rashi is saying, it would belong to all the firstborn descendants of Esav. Says Yaakov, Ein Chakadai, Ein Rosh hazeh kedai. It's not right that it should be you and your descendants. Right, it would take hundreds of years until the Beis HaMikdash would actually be built, and they would work in the Beis HaMikdash. But Yaakov sees in Esav not just the Rasha, but all of his descendants would be Rishayim as well. Again, this is how I understand the Rashi. Yaakov says to Esav, it shouldn't be you. You're a Rasha, your descendants are also going to be Rishayim. I'm not the Bechor, but I want to buy from you the rights to serve in the Beis HaMikdash. Sell it to me for a pot of soup. Open your hearts. Vayomer Esav says, Hine anoichi hoylech lamus. I'm going to die. V'lomos eli b'chayra. What do I need the b'chayra for? I'm going to die. What do I need the b'chayra for? All right, on the simple level, Esav was basically saying, no one lives forever, who cares, I'm hungry now, etc. But obviously that's not what it means. Yaakov's not asking him for anything from him. Yaakov's saying, we're talking about his descendants. Zokt Rashi, Hine anoichi hoylech lamus, I'm going to die. Esav gave Yaakov a shiur in Jewish history. Esav gave Yaakov an education that in his mind made Yaakov look and sound like a fool. So Rashi, Esav says to Yaakov, Misnoidedes v'ilechas ya b'chayra, shaloi tehei kol Esav avoda b'chayros, Kishevet Levi Yitoloisa, says Esav to Yaakov, I don't understand. What's your issue and your obsession with the fact that B'chorim work in the Beis HaMikdash? This right that I have as a firstborn to work in the Beis HaMikdash for my descendants is going to die. It's not what's going to end up happening in the end. It's going to be Shevet Levi working in the Beis HaMikdash and not the firstborns. The firstborns are going to lose this right when they worship the Egel Azov. And in the end, says Esav to Yaakov, it's not my firstborn descendants, and it's not your firstborn descendants. It's Shevet Levi B'chlal. What are you obsessed with, Bechira? Levi is going to be one of your sons anyways. It's got nothing to do with being firstborn. You want the firstborn rights to serving in the Beis HaMikdash, says Esav? I'll sell it to you for a pot of lentil soup. It's worthless. It's not going to materialize even for one day. There wasn't one day in the Mishkan when the Bechorim served as the representatives of Klal Yisrael. It was Shevet Levi from day one because the Egel Azov happened 40 days after Matan Torah. This is not a simple conversation between Yaakov and Esav. We're talking about who's going to have the zechus to work in the Beis HaMikdash. Yaakov says to Esav, it shouldn't be you and your descendants, the firstborns. You guys are Rishoyim. You know what Yaakov says to Esav? You know what Esav says to Yaakov in response? Your firstborn descendants are Rishoyim too. Get off your high horse, says Esav to Yaakov. You're calling me an Oived Avodah Zorah, a Megala Arayas, a Shofech Domim. Guess what? The Gemara says that when they worshipped the Egel Azov, they committed Avodah Zorah, Gilui Arayas, and Shfichas Domim. Who do you think you are, says Esav to Yaakov, lecturing me, calling me a Rasha? You're telling me I'm not worthy. You want the firstborn rights? Take him. For a pot of lentil soup, I'll sell it to you. Your firstborns are going to be just like Esav. The Bechira is worth nothing. Rashi. Chumash Rashi. Who's right? Esav or Yaakov? Yaakov makes Esav swear that he would sell him the firstborn. The Medrash says that the Rabbanu Shloim came down from heaven and told the angels to write up a document that Esav had sold his firstborn rights to Yaakov. But in the end, Esav has an argument. Esav says, what are you talking about? You're worried about who's going to work in the Beis HaMikdash? You know who's going to work in the Beis HaMikdash? Shevet Levi. Nicht mein Bechorim und nicht dein Bechorim. As far as the Bechorim are concerned, they're all guilty of Avodah Zorah, Gilui Arayas, and Shfichas Domim. What's the difference if they're descendants of Esav or descendants of Yaakov? I should tell you that the commentaries discuss what actually will happen when Mashiach comes. Please God, may it be speedily in our days. And the third Beis HaMikdash will be rebuilt. Hinted to by this third well that the Ramban said, that the Torah is talking about. Rechoivos. Who's going to worship in the Beis HaMikdash then? Shevet Levi or the firstborns? The commentaries argue, actually. Does it remain Shevet Levi's or does it go back to the firstborn? But in truth, it's not really an argument. The truth is, of course, we know that it'll be both. In the end, it'll be both. Shevet Levi will have their schus of working in the Beis HaMikdash, and the Bechorim, who were initially the ones given this right, but it was taken away from them because of their Averis. Once Mashiach comes and the tshuva process is complete, once Mashiach comes and the tshuva process is complete, the Bechorim will be restored to their position of greatness. And they will also be able to work in the Beis HaMikdash. It'll be Mashiach's job, together with figuring out how to make peace between the Jews and the rest of the world, and to bring world peace, etc. It'll be his job to figure out how to balance the firstborns and Shevet Levi, make sure nobody is offended and everybody has, their right position. in the end, both will be part of it. But I think what the Torah is teaching us at the essence, is that Esav represents every anti-Semite for all of history that will rise up against us to destroy us. Is characterized, is the icon for this is Esav. And every Yid, of course, when we all trace our ancestry, we're represented by Yaakov, Esav, and Hamman. And the Esavs of the world turn to the Yaakovs of the world and say, you got to stop lecturing us. You got to stop pointing fingers at us and calling us Rishonim. You guys are just as guilty as we are. You see, worse or just as bad as our enemies' seemingly endless need to persecute us physically and to crush our bodies and Rahman al-Islam to annihilate us completely. Just as painful or just as bad, or maybe I would even say worse than that, is their never-ending arguments to demoralize us. More than anything, the Esavs of the world want to point to the Yaakovs of the world and say, you're no different than us. You're the same. And in its very essence, this is the argument of every Yid, to say, even Rahman al-Islam, if a Jew descends to the pit of spiritual darkness, avodah zarah, gila, rise, and shvichas damim, a Yaakov is never an Esav. Never. Even if the Esav can't see it. And even if a Yid Rahman al-Islam worships the Egel Azov and all that comes along with it, in the end the Yid will always do tshuva and rise up and be reunited with Hashem, be a Baal tshuva even greater than before. They call us names. They seek to demoralize us and strip us of our spirituality, strip us of our connection to Hashem. Lashkichom Torasecha. They want nothing more than to tell the Jew, you're the same human goy like everybody else. And at times their arguments seem pretty powerful. And the Yaakovs of the world stand up and say, no. You don't understand what it is that's going on here. It's the Yaakovs of the world who look at the Esavs of the world and say, you don't know what it means to be a B'chor. You have no idea what it means to serve in the Beis HaMikdash. You don't understand Jewish history. You're looking and you're seeing spiritual darkness. You're looking and you're seeing physical darkness. Du verstehst nicht die Neshama von a Yid. You don't understand. No matter what the Yiddish Neshama comes through, at some point it'll persevere and it'll break out and nothing can get in its way. Esav doesn't understand that. Maybe the reason why the commentaries are so insistent on going back over and over again to the story of Purim in this week's Parsha is because it's the same thing with the story of Purim, and the Gemara articulates this so incredibly powerfully. The Gemara says, Haman comes to Achashverosh. Achashverosh, he says, let's wipe out the Jews. Achashverosh was just as much an anti-Semite as Haman, if not more. Come on, says Haman to Achashverosh. We'll work together. We have the power. There's nowhere for the Jews to run. Let's commit genocide. Let's sentence them to death. And one day we'll wipe them out and we'll be done with them. The conscience of the world. The Gemara says, you know what Achashverosh told Haman? He said, I want to do it just as much as you, if not more than you, but it's a bad idea. Because their God is very powerful. And their God eliminates everybody who starts up with his children. Look what happened to Paroi, look what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, look what happened to Sancheriv, look what happened, etc., etc. Says Achashverosh to Haman, don't mess. You're going to end up being cut down. Nothing will be left of you. The Rabbi Shalom protects his children, says Achashverosh to Haman. You're messing, you're pushing the atomic bomb here. It's going to blow up in your face. Says the Gemara, Haman reassures Achashverosh, this time is different. This time the Rabbi Shalom is not going to defend the Jews. You know why? Yeshnoi am echod mefuzar u'mefoyrod beino amim. There is a nation scattered among the people, says the Gemara. Haman told Achashverosh, the Jews have spiritually yoshnu, fallen asleep. They've abandoned the Torah. They've abandoned mitzvahs. They're sitting at the meal of Achashverosh and they're enjoying it. And says Haman, when I walk in the streets, the Jews are all bowing down to me. They're bowing down to me. You want to tell me their God will protect them? For what? They've forgotten who they are. They're sitting at a meal which you made to celebrate the fact that the Beis HaMikdash is not being rebuilt with the Kalim of the Beis HaMikdash, dressed like a Kohen Gadol, despite the fact that Mordechai told them not to. And they're enjoying it. These types of Jews are no longer worthy of Hashem's protection. Says Mordechai, says Haman to Achashverosh, you have nothing to fear. Achashverosh is very trepidatious. Do they have Talmidei Chachamim, he asks Haman. Do they have leaders? Do they have rabbis who will bring them back to Teshuvah? They're all asleep. They're all out to lunch. Nothing to be afraid of. The Jewish people, says Haman to Achashverosh, are no different from us. And so Achashverosh reluctantly gives his signet ring to Haman. All right, he says, you want to sentence him to death? Go ahead. And so Haman does. And then what happens? And then the Jews wake up. Their Yiddish neshama, having nowhere to run, rises and roars like only a Yiddish neshama can. And with unity, the Jewish trait, this unbelievable adrenaline that the Jewish people have when we're faced with disaster, the unity among the Jewish people emerges, and all together they band together, and they stand, the Medrash says, at Mordechai's feet, and they say to him, we will not abandon you in life and in death. We are Jews. As Jews we were born, and as Jews we will die. The Alter Rebbe writes in Likutei Torah, there wasn't a Jew, in Torah, says there wasn't a Jew in all of Klal Yisrael for an entire year from the time of the issuing of the decree until the Jews defended themselves, until the 13th of Ad. There wasn't a Jew who even thought to turn their backs on their identity as Jews. Once again, our enemies underestimated us. The Baal Haturim says the word vayives, and he cheapened and he disgraced, is used the same by Esav and by Haman. What's the big deal about the word vayives? Vayives Esav esabchayra and vayives be'enov. Why is this vayives a big deal? Vayives means he disgraced. Vayives means he underestimated. Vayives be'enov l'shloyach yod b'mordechai levadai means that Haman underestimated who he was dealing with. He didn't understand that he was dealing with the nation of Mordechai, a people who wouldn't be intimidated, a people who wouldn't be squashed, a people whose neshama would emerge no matter what. Vayives. Says the Baal Haturim, it's the same Vayives as Esav. Esav looks at Yaakov and says, B'chayra, my B'chayrim are Rishoim, your B'chayrim are also Rishoim. Says the Torah, no! Vayives Esav esab B'chayra. Esav is underestimating, he's undermining the B'chayrim of Yaakov. Yes, they will sin, but that sin is superficial. When push comes to shove and their identity, their existence is questioned, the Yiddish neshama will rise and will roar, they'll do tshuva, and they'll be restored like nothing and no one else. The Esav and his great-grandson Haman are underestimating the Jew. And the Baal Haturim says, Esav purchasing the firstborn, Yaakov purchasing the firstborn is the same as Mordechai purchasing Haman. It's the same thing. Before Jewish history began, the Torah says, Yaakov already owned Esav. He was his slave. Everything that Esav has already belonged to Yaakov, because he bought the birthright, and he got the bracha, and Yitzchak, his father, told him, The sons of your mother will bow down to you. Everything that you have is owned by them. And the same is true with Haman. And you know what it means in a spiritual sense? It means that Jews have to remember that may Hashem protect us no matter what we go through. No matter which Hamans of the world and which Hamases of the world and which Rahman Litzlan, Stalins and Hitler, Yemach Shemam B'Zichram, enemies again and again and again. From the beginning of time until the end of time, we were here before them and we will be here after them. We owned them before they started and we'll own them after they're done. We'll, as the speakers like to say, right? We'll turn them into latkes and into homentashen and into ashen porach. We were here before, we'll be here. The Jewish people are eternal. Nothing scares us. No matter what the Esavs of the world say or argue or do, the Jew looks at the Esavs of the world and says, Vayivez, you're cheapening something. You don't understand what you're talking about. B'chayra, the rights to serve in the Beis HaMikdash, it's ours forever. The Averis that we do are completely superficial. If ever there is an Esav and a Yaakov in the world, if ever there is a Mordechai and a Hamman in the world, says the Torah, remember, Yaakov owns Esav, Mordechai owns Hamman, they are our slaves. If the Rebbeinu Shalom allows them for but a moment to rear their ugly heads and do whatever it is that they're doing, don't be afraid. There's no real threat here. Unfortunately, for reasons we don't understand, sometimes along the way, Rahman al-Islam, we pay a heavy price. But as a people, but as a nation, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Matzileinu Miyadam, we're safe and we're secure. I remember in the early 90s, when there was the very famous Gulf War, and at that time Saddam Hussein, Yemach Shemai B'Zichrei, sent dozens of missiles into Eretz Yisrael, and the Jews in Israel all bought gas masks because they were so concerned that there were chemical warheads on these bombs, and that they would Rahman al-Islam gas the Jews. And every Jew in Israel put on a gas mask every time the alarm sounded and these missiles came flying. And I remember at that time the Lubavitcher Rebbe quoted a medrash. He said, the medrash says that the Jewish people are going to see at some point, Umois Mizgaroi Zubazu, the nations are waging war with each other. And the whole world is trembling. The whole world is trembling. And the Rebbeinu Shalom turns to the Jews and says, Bonai, my children, Al Tisyoru. The Rebbeinu Shalom turns to the Jews and says, my children, my sons, my daughters, the Jewish people. Al Tisyoru, do not be afraid. Let not your hearts become weak. Chas v'sholom. Kol masha sisi lo yasisi elu b'shvilchem. Hashem says the purpose of all of existence, the purpose of the creation of the world, the purpose of everything here is only for you, the Jews. 15, 16 million human beings in a sea today of 8 billion plus human beings, and all the whole world can talk about, obsessed with, is Israel and the Jewish people. And our enemies are once again calling us hypocrites. They want us to feel cheap. They want us to feel like we're no better than them. And they're calling for our genocide. And the Torah says it's a vayivez. It's a cheapening. Esav cheapens and Haman cheapens, and nobody knows when you touch a Jew, nobody knows who they're messing with. And it doesn't matter how many times Achashverosh warns them, don't do it. They still don't learn their lesson. And the Rebbeinu Shalom takes every Jew by the hand and begs them, please, remember, there is absolutely nothing to fear. And the Ramban says, as I mentioned before, that the second well that they dug, Sitna, represents the second Beis HaMikdash. I'll tell you how I think this is connected to the same idea as well. The Jewish people are trying to build a second Beis HaMikdash. The sons of Haman stop them. Kosvu Sitna. They write a letter. They seem to be successful. Could you imagine the Jewish people coming back from Golus, trying to rebuild the house of Hashem? Sons of Haman are getting in their way. Esav's, Haman's of the world, once again, getting in between the Jews and their Beis HaMikdash. Could you imagine how painful this must have been for the Jews? They're physically trying to construct the Beis HaMikdash. And some Yemach Shemam, sons of Haman, is getting in their way. And the king sides with them. And you know what the commentaries say? What's the truth? What's the real reason? What's the real reason why the construction of the Beis HaMikdash was halted at that time? Because the 70 years weren't up. All right, there's many different ways to calculate the 70 years. But the way the Ribbono Shel Olam, the true way to calculate the 70 years, was not up yet. So the Ribbono Shel Olam was in effect saying to the Jews, don't be afraid. Al tisyoru b'shvilchem, it's for your own sake. You'll wait for the right time, and then when you'll construct the second Beis HaMikdash, it'll stand for as long as it's supposed to stand. How long is that? 420 years, even longer than the first Beis HaMikdash. Says the Ramban, Yitzchak watches his well being dug and then being fought over by Goyim, who claim that Eretz Yisrael belongs to them and we have no right to the water of Eretz Yisrael. And Yitzchak looks at it and he goes, Sitna, the second Beis HaMikdash, will stand for as long as it's supposed to stand, will be built at the time that it's supposed to be built, and then it'll be destroyed. But it's not the final, eternal destination of the Jewish people. The final place for the Jews, please God, with the coming of Mashiach, is Rechovos, when everything will be opened up for the Jews, and everything will be eternal. The story of Yaakov and Esav, in the end, is the story of every Jew surviving every anti-Semitic attack. It's every Goy, it's every anti-Semite, it's every Stalin and Hitler, Yemach Shemam V'Zichram, who've tried to annihilate us. It's the same story over B'chol Dor. We go through in every generation. It's the same Yaakov telling Esav, you don't know who you're messing with. I'm going to own you before we start. It's the same Mordechai lifting up his foot at every Haman and says, not only am I not going to bow down to you, but I own you and everything you have, and if you mess with me, I'll destroy you and your entire family and the entire nation of Amalek. And it's the same Ribbono Shel Olam who turns to every Jew and says, Al tisyoru, don't be afraid. Chazak ve'amatz, be strong and courageous. The Jewish people, Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish people, are always victorious. Of course, as we're learning this, we can't help but experience this emotionally as well as the Jewish people, our brothers and sisters in Israel, and all around the world really, are facing anti-Semitism, the likes of which we haven't seen, Rahman al-Islam, since Kristallnacht. And a Jew can be tempted to look at this and say, Ribbono Shel Olam, what in heaven's name is going on here? Esav, Haman, sons of Haman. They're rallying in university campuses and college campuses, Rahman al-Islam, screaming, Israel, Israel, you can't hide. They're calling for our genocide. Rahman al-Islam. Says the Torah, protect yourself. Go out and fight. Be responsible. Support our brothers and sisters, Tzva Hagana Yisrael, who are fighting to protect Eretz Yisrael, who are fighting to protect Jews all over the world. But don't just focus on the physical protection. Focus on the spiritual protection. What's the spiritual protection? Number one, Jewish unity like we've never seen it before. Number two, remember that tefillin and tzitzis and mitzvahs protect Klal Yisrael like protect Klal Yisrael on the level of the soul. And most importantly, Bonai, says the Ribbono Shel Olam, Al tisyoru, don't be afraid. We've been through all of this and we're here. They always try to underestimate us. They were always wrong. We were here before them. We'll be here long after them. We're waiting for the third well, the Rechovos, where we can finally say, Ki ato hirchiv Hashem lanu, the Ribbono Shel Olam has relieved us of our enemies. We can be fruitful and successful in the land. Please God, with the coming of our righteous Mashiach, may it be speedily in our days. Amen.